much better. Welcome to WNYC. Welcome to the green space. I didn't think I was going to have this microphone. And welcome to the launch of the Other Box project. Some of the people in this room have been with me on this project for almost 3 years. Some of you are coming to this project for the first time tonight. But it really doesn't matter when you started or how you are coming to this moment, because we're all in this now together. Tonight we're going to embark on a journey of engagement, a journey of radical evolution, and a journey of constructive change. What is the Other Box project? Through photography, documentary, and feature film, and public conversations like the one we're about to have here tonight, the Other Box project will explore love, hello Tracy, race, and identity in the 21st century, and in Trump's America, in new ways that will challenge the new nationalism and resurgent supremacy in our country, white supremacy. In short, we believe that working together, we can deconstruct the race construct. So let's get down to business. This is the first of what will be 8 public conversations over the course of the next 12 months. Ambitious, we know. Tonight's conversation is conceived in 3 broad themes. First, love, then race, and then identity. But first, every one of you should have on your seat, I'm looking to my family for some help because I was supposed to have one here. There we go, husband of mine. But you're gonna still fill it out, though I know which box you'll check. All right, so you got this form. Everybody have this form? It's the white form with the boxes. 9 categories. Somebody count? Call me a liar if I'm wrong. How many boxes are on the form? Did you count, Jax? All right, that's my son. I want to make sure he can count. You have a little golf. You know that pencil you have is called a golf crayon? Take your golf crayon and check 1 box. But you may only check 1 box. You cannot check more than 1 box. If you check more than 1 box, your sheet will be disqualified. Now we move on to love, the first part of our program. Now we're gathered here today because it's June 12th, what many people call Loving Day. Say it louder, please. Loving Day. It's Loving Day. The 50th anniversary of the decision in Loving versus Virginia. Virginia, of course, is the state of Virginia. And Loving, unbelievably, the couple was named Loving. Richard Loving, Mildred Loving. But their story goes back 9 years before 1967. It goes back to the year in which they were married. So to help us tell the story, I want to invite Sean Qualls and Selena Alka and their daughter Ginger to the stage. They're going to read from the book they created together, The Case for Loving.
Hi, everyone.
Hello.
Really happy to be here.
Okay, here we go. Richard was white, a fair-skinned boy who got quickly sunburned in July. Mildred was what they called colored in those days, her skin a creamy caramel.
In 1958, they lived in the small town of Central Point, Virginia, where people every shade from the color of chamomile tea to summer midnight made their homes.
Richard was a tall, quiet man of English and Irish heritage. The person he loved the most was Mildred Jeter. Mildred was part African-American, part Native American, and she was thin as a rail. That's how she got the nickname String Bean.
When Richard popped the question, String Bean jumped with joy.
The two were in love. They felt it should be their right to get married. Sadly, it was not. Not in Virginia or 16 other states. In those places, marriage between people of different races was against the law.
Although they couldn't have a legal marriage in Virginia, they could right next door in Washington, D.C. So they invited a few friends and family to witness their wedding across state lines. At the ceremony, nobody objected when Richard said,
I do.
and Mildred said,
I do too.
The Lovings were officially pronounced husband and wife. The blushing bride and her groom smiled all the way from D.C. back to their house in Virginia. They couldn't wait to start a family.
But soon, something terrible happened. In the middle of the night, they were awoken in their sleep. It was the police. An officer shouted at Richard, "What are you doing with that woman?" Richard proudly pointed to their marriage certificate hanging on the wall. "That's not good here," the policeman boomed.
And just like that, Mildred and Richard were taken away and locked up in jail. They were charged with unlawful cohabitation, which means living together against the law. The Lovings didn't think there was anything unlawful about their love at all. If anything, the way they were treated should be unlawful.
They tried to make a life for themselves in D.C. Richard found a job laying bricks, and Stringbean gave birth to 3 babies, 3 different shades of milk chocolate brown: Donald, Peggy, and Sydney. But the city did not suit the Lovings. There were too many cars. There was too much concrete. They missed Central Point with its rolling hills and its open spaces. They missed their friends and families. They missed their home.
They wanted to return to Virginia for good, so they hired lawyers to help fight for what was right. By now, it was 1966, and the times were changing.
The lawyers worked around the clock to make the case for interracial marriage as strong as possible. It was time to take the Loving case all the way to the Supreme Court.
It didn't take long for a decision to be made. It was unanimous. The court ruled in favor of the Lovings. Interracial couples can now legally marry in Virginia. Richard and Mildred hugged. They won the right to their love. They were free at last. Over 9 years after the arrest, the Lovings packed their bags in one final time. Richard planned to build a big, roomy brick house in Central Point. Stringbean was ready to start their life over. The Loving family returned to Virginia to live
Happily and legally ever after.
Thank you.
A big thank you to Selena and Sean, and especially to Ginger. More on their book, The Case, called The Case for Loving, later in the evening. And here it is one more time. I love it. And with that very special telling of the Loving story, let me bring out our first contributor to the Other Box project. Benno Schmidt was very literally in the room where it happened, as they say on Broadway, when the Loving decision came down. Let's welcome him to the green space. And Benno Schmidt, our audience members all have your bio to save us a little bit of time, but for the benefit of those who are live streaming this event, they may be smart enough to Google it up, but I have to mention also that in the mix of all of your accolades, you're also a scholar of the U.S. Supreme Court and the history of race relations in the U.S. So with that in mind, set the stage for us. You clerked for the Warren Court in the most contentious times in this country, with the obvious exception of the Civil War era. Now, the Lovings were not activists. They weren't marching on Washington, though it's become clear in the historical record that they were inspired by those events. But the times, if you will, may make the couple. The Racial Integrity Act is the law they challenged, and It was passed in 1924 and amended over time to become even more draconian. I can't list all of the points in the act, but I'm going to put the relevant portion of it before our audience. It forbade the marriage of any white person with someone of another race. It specifically defined white person as one who, quote, has no race whatsoever of any blood other than Caucasian. And specific to the Lovings, out-of-state interracial marriages were not recognized in the state of Virginia, and cohabitation and extramarital sex was also subject to the act. Now, 41 states at the peak of these laws recognized them, but by the time the Lovings came to the court, 17 states had these laws, and by the time the case came down, only 16. So the laws were changing, the times were changing. Benno Schmidt, why did the court take the Lovings case? What compelled the court to grant certiorari?
Well, the Loving case came 13 years after Brown against the school board. And indeed, the Loving case was the last of a long line of racial discrimination cases that started with Brown, the school segregation decision in 1954. And what had not been clear, the Brown case, that when Chief Justice Warren wrote the opinion in the Brown case, he talked more about education than he did about racial discrimination. He called public education the most important responsibility of state and local government. And the case was so much about the importance of education that many people, when Brown was decided, thought it was really a case about discrimination, racial discrimination in public education, and that it was not allowed racial discrimination in public education because public education was so important, a governmental responsibility, and so important in shaping the lives of young people. And it was not clear after Brown that racial classifications that touched on other aspects of life would actually be prohibited by the court. And then after Brown, the court applied Brown without any further opinion, just what we call per curiam, just citing Brown and leaving it at that, in knocking off and in declaring unconstitutional racial segregation in other walks of life, so swimming pools and lakes and beaches, racial segregation in places of, in restrooms and so forth. And this whole line of cases came down over the years, but there remained this ambiguity about what was Brown really about. Was it an education case, which is what most of the opinion talked about, or was it some broader principle of racial discrimination being disallowed? Now, the same time that Brown came down, a case involving the very same Virginia miscegenation law came to the Supreme Court. It was called Name versus Name. And it was an appeal from the Virginia Supreme Court's decision that an interracial marriage involving an Asian, I think it was an Asian man and a white woman, was invalid. And the court had a chance at the time of Brown to take that case. Indeed, Warren wanted to take it at the time of Brown. But a majority of the court did not want to take miscegenation on so early. You see, miscegenation was the most difficult of all the racial segregation issues for whites. When Brown was criticized by white racists, it was on the ground that, well, integration in public education is going to produce blacks marrying whites, and you're going to have interracial babies, they call them mongrel children, and so forth. So a majority of the court wanted to duck miscegenation because it was the most, it was something that racists cared more about than anything else for some reason. So the court ducked it in name and left the Virginia decision in place. And indeed, in the Loving case, the Virginia Supreme Court relied on name against name as being a decision where the Supreme Court of the United States had actually had a chance to strike down miscegenation and had not.
Yeah.
And so the court, a majority of the court, this was not Warren's view, but a majority of the court wanted to delay.
And the 1924 law is rooted in white supremacy and is designed to maintain that hegemony and that supremacy. But eventually Warren not only convinces the court to take the case, but secures a unanimous decision. So you're there in the court. Tell us how Brown is a unanimous decision,
Brown,
of course.
Yes,
but
Brown is unanimous.
How does that work politically
and
as a legal matter? How does he get a unanimous decision on so contentious an issue? He writes the majority, surely with your help. How does that come about in 1967?
Well, he realizes, and indeed all the justices realized, that Loving was the last of the line of cases that started with Brown against the Board of Education. And Warren took advantage of the opportunity to clarify in the Loving decision what that whole line of cases was about. Loving came down 50 years ago today in June, which is the busiest, the last month the court's sitting, handing down more opinions in June than any other month. It's a tremendously busy time of the year for the court. So Warren assigned to me, I was one of his law clerks, the task of doing a first draft of the Loving opinion, which I did. And I did it and relied on Brown and the line of cases involving segregation as it had been declared unconstitutional in public pools and various other arenas. And I just cited those cases and pretty much left it at that. Warren took that draft and he made three, I think, rather important additions. First, he said the issue had never been decided by the Supreme Court. So he took name versus name and treated it as not a decision on the merits, just something that the court had failed to take up before. The second thing that he did was he said that the Virginia miscegenation law was an expression of white supremacy. And he made it clear that it was as an expression of white supremacy that was the reason the Equal Protection Clause, the equality principle of the 14th Amendment, prohibited it. And what that meant was, for the first time, it indicated that, at least as far as Warren was concerned, it was racial classifications that were expressions of white supremacy that the Constitution did not permit. So that would mean, for example, that racial classifications that are not an expression of white supremacy, for affirmative action, for example, or other things, that those could be fine, those could be constitutional. So he made it clear that from Brown on, it was the idea of white supremacy that was embodied in all these racial discriminations that was the ground for the statutes being denying the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The third thing he added to my draft was, if anything, even more important. And he added a completely separate second ground for striking down the Virginia Miscegenation law. He said every person in the United States enjoys, under the Due Process Clause of the 14th Amendment, the right to marry, and that the right to marry could not be taken away on unreasonable grounds, one of which was racial discrimination. So he created a separate substantive due process right to marry at the end of the Loving decision. And of course, that right to marry, which was really in a way born in the Loving decision, that would later become the basis for the same-sex decisions that we've had here in the 21st century, where the right to marry has been held to allow same-gender wedlock and so forth.
So Richard Loving and Mildred Loving famously did not attend the arguments, but Richard Loving said to his lawyers, "Tell the court I love my wife, and it's just not fair that I can't live with her in the state of Virginia." Do you think the court heard that message?
Well, I think, yes, I do. I think the court was unanimous. The court felt that two adults should have a right to marry whomever they want. Now, the issue in Loving was a man and a woman, so the same-sex issue would come up much later. But if people of different races wanted to get married, that was their right. And no legislature could take that away on the ground of interracial marriage being banned. So I think Loving, turned out to be very important as the Supreme Court had never before used the phrase white supremacy before Loving. The first time ever in all the Brown line of cases, never appeared. And so I think it sheds a great deal of light retrospectively on the cases that started with Brown, and it created the basis for what we've seen in our own day to be this expanded right to marry that now embraces same-sex couples.
Benno Schmidt, ladies and gentlemen. Please now welcome WQXR's Hilary Bonhomme and Crystal Hawes.
That soon you'll be drenched to the bone. If your time to you is worth saving, then you better start swimming or you'll sink like a stone. For the times they are changing. Come writers and critics who prophesize with your pen, and keep your eyes wide, the chance won't come again. And don't speak too soon, for the wheels still spin, and there's no telling who that it's naming. For the loser now and later to win, for the times they are changing. Come senators, congressmen, please heed the call. Don't stand in the doorway, don't block up the hall, for he who gets hurt will be he who has stalled. There's a battle outside and it's raging. It'll soon shake your windows and rattle your walls, for the times they are changing. Come mothers and fathers throughout the land, and don't criticize what you can't understand. Your sons and your daughters are beyond your command. Your old road is rapidly aging. Please get out of the new one if you can't lend your hand, for the times they are changing. The line it is drawn, the curse it is cast. The slow one now will later be fast, and the wealth of it now will later be past. The order is rapidly fading, and the first one now will be later be last, for the times they are changing.
WQXR's Hillary Bonham and Crystal Oz. Thank you, ladies. That question that I asked Benno Schmidt about love and family and whether the court recognized the real life impact of loving brings us directly to our next guest, and she's here to tackle our second broad theme. Remember, we have three themes: love, race, identity. She is a courageous person from a courageous family, and she's taking on perhaps the most challenging of our three themes tonight, race. Let's warmly welcome Gina Belafonte. We did some catching up in the green room, so we know where we're going with this conversation. So, Gina, first, I'm diving right in. We all know you and your famous activist father and
Yes.
parents. And your work, your important work as a world-changing woman and actor and activist in your own right, but we don't know all the detail. So I'm going to come right out and ask that question that people always ask me, and I hate it, but I'm asking it. What are you? Tell us about your racial and ethnic background. And do you think people who don't know you see you as you see yourself?
Well, when I was growing up and had a moment to understand that I was searching for identity, people would say, "What are you?" And I would say, "My mother's white, my father's black, and I'm Puerto Rican." You know, because I'm from New York, and
It works.
It made the most sense to me in terms of what I looked like. So in one of your other comment questions, which is, do I think people see me as I see myself? I have no idea. As an actor, I often had to check that other box. I checked it over and over and over again. It was always like, you're filling out the information, you're nervous, you want to be the one, you want to be right for the role, and you get to that, and all of a sudden, like, everything comes up for you before you even go in the door to have the opportunity to audition. What am I? Oh my God. Well, today I'm a doctor, and tomorrow I'm going to be the waitress at the, because as an actor, you're anything you can possibly be. I'm Jewish, I'm Greek, I'm Puerto Rican, I'm whatever. So there was, I think the arts helped me not have to deal in certain ways around that question, because I was able to try and be as many things as possible. But as I got older, I've had recently, most recently, I would say in the last maybe 15, 20 years, I never really considered myself one or the other. But doing the work that I do now, there's no question what I am in the eyes of many, which is that I'm Black. And that's that. If any of you know my mother who is a Russian-Lithuanian woman from the Lower West Side, she's sometimes Blacker than most Black people I know in terms of her traditions, in terms of her, not just the way she acts, because it's not about the way she acts, but really in her core being, she was the only white member of an all-Black dance company. She was very invested in the Yoruba religion and interested in the energy that religion offered in terms of protection and ritual, and also the dances that are indigenous to that religion from Haiti and Africa, from the diaspora. And since I haven't been acting as much, I've just been going around the world accepting what people feel they need to identify me as, because I'm a human being. Race in America is completely designed by sort of colonial misogyny. And I just recently went to Senegal, where I got this beautiful garment that I'm wearing. And
Just last week, right?
Just last week. And I had never been, and I went to Gorée Island, and I was there at the door of no return in the last slave house, and you can feel it. You can feel the cries of the ancestors. You can feel the disorientation. You can feel the horror of what it must have been like, preparing a meal in your village and your children are playing, and the elders, I envision being in circle with the young adults, and the men in circle talking about the kill of the day, and then all of a sudden, a bunch of what we'll call at the moment white men arrive with guns and just change the course of history. Right. Over and over and over again. Right. So race, and what was interesting about being in Senegal for me was that doing the work that I do with the movement for Black Lives Matter, for using the arts to shine a light on specific issues through the work I do at our organization, Sankofa, you can really begin to see the generational trauma from slavery to the streets of Flint, Michigan in a water crisis, or Ferguson during the killing of Mike Brown, or Staten Island with Eric I mean, you just see it over and over and over again. And it's incredible how we've just sort of had to go through life.
I have so many places I could go with everything you said. I mean, when you talk about the ancestors, there are the ancestors who were our slave ancestors, and in my case, there were the ancestors who were aligned with those who stepped off those ships to bring the slaves to you, and I have to acknowledge that. So, and many of us in this room have to acknowledge, I am not alone. But I want to come back to your childhood and what you were saying about your mother.
Yes.
I was thinking of Color of Water, James McBride's beautiful book, which I commend to anyone who came to this event, would be self-selecting to want to read that book if you haven't read it. But your parents, I want to say 1957?
Yes.
Okay, so that's 10 years before the Loving decision.
Yes.
Difficult for them?
Very. My father was on the rise as a celebrity. He was really paving a way by then.
And an activist. Associated with the civil rights movement and human rights movement?
Yes, definitely. He was an activist. He was embedded in the civil rights movement by then. He and my mother tried to get housing on the Upper West Side and were denied. because they were interracial. They were interracial union, and so my father, with some other folks, bought the building that they were trying to get into, and are famous for sort of making the idea of cooperative apartments fashionable and cool. And I think part of that, the Upper West Side is sort of known for its progressive and sort of liberal vibe to it, and I think my parents played a big role in that, in that period. When my brother was born, my mother, we were both born at Mount Sinai Hospital here on Fifth Avenue in the 90s, and my mother received a letter, which we just recently found, that said a lot of things, but one of the things it says is congratulations on your nigger baby.
And you've recently found that letter.
Yeah.
You didn't know about it as a child, of course. You were protected.
No, it was welcoming my brother into the world.
And still pains you very much, clearly. And yet your sense of identity has evolved to blackness.
Yeah, I think it has. I think that many people in the movement have claimed me in a way, which I'm grateful for. There's nothing better than feeling that you have an identity, especially when you're Negro and then you're a nigger and then you're a Negro and then you're colored and then you're black and then you're African American and then you're Puerto Rican. I mean, so you have, so when people, I mean, I had a doctor and a gynecologist doctor, a black gynecologist doctor who I've gone to forever, who delivered my child. And we were having this conversation about, I would say about maybe 15, 20 years ago, or maybe it was even longer because my daughter's 20 now. So it was maybe a little bit longer than that. And we were having this conversation. I was like, people they don't think I'm black. I mean, I get into situations where people talk to me and they say certain things and they have no idea who I am. And he looked at me, he was like, what, are you kidding me? I was like, no, really. He's like, girl, you are black. It's like, oh, please. I was like, I mean, I am fine claiming my blackness and fine claiming my Jewishness and my, Russian Lithuanianness. The Catholic part, I'm not so great at claiming. But identity is a very tricky thing. And I think a person who is mixed, and maybe it's because I have a sense of privilege because I'm so fair-skinned, but I'm so over it. Mm-hmm. I really, I mean, it's a critical issue. I will be working on it forever. It feels like I will just call folks out forever because I think it's an important issue. But in my heart, it's just, come on now, we're human beings. We gotta get over this concept that there is a better than and an other box to check. I mean, if you go all the way back to Bacon's Rebellion and you think of the construct of race and why it was created, it was all about economics. It was all about, pitting the working class against each other because the word white, there was no such thing. It went into, you were Portuguese, you were African, or depending on where you were from in Africa, you were, Greek, you were Italian, but you weren't white and black.
Agreed that we have to get over it.
We got to get over it. We got to get through it.
Then
we got to get over it.
Right. So we're getting through it.
We're getting through it. I'm hopeful.
So what do you say to, you have a 20-year-old daughter?
I have a 20-year-old daughter.
I have an 18-year-old daughter.
My daughter is really very interesting.
So what?
No, she is. She has a Scottish, English father. I mean, when we're talking about what part of white he is. Mm-hmm. And she is extremely fair with very straight hair and
so what do you
walking
say?
down
what
the
do we
street.
say to these young
I don't. I mean,
to get through
she's very
it.
clear on what she is, and she let everybody know that she feels she's black. She don't. I mean, she would. I mean, she doesn't. I mean, no one's ever asked her because she's white, But
we're streaming.
Yes, yeah, we're streaming. So Maria, get with it, right? No, but she, it was our very famous Black History Month, and she was in school, and her grandfather came up, and she made a comment. She's like, "Oh, that's my grandfather," and someone was like, "What do you mean that's your grandfather?" She turned to them. She was like, "Yeah, I'm Black." And they were like, "Whatever," she's born and raised in California, but. So that's a whole other conversation, but yeah, identity. There's identity, and then there's race, and then there's this crazy mix in between, and
Right.
we all just need to, get through it.
Right.
And I really, those of you who identify as white, y'all need to have some conversations, some really hard conversations with your fellow white people. And help them to understand their history, because a lot of them don't. A lot of them just don't. They just, and they're like, well, I have Black friends, and I'm, and they're like, we understand that.
I voted for Obama.
Right, exactly. I voted for, and I would have voted for him again. But I really think it's about the history. It's about understanding, like Bacon's Rebellion. It's about there's a really great lecture called Birth of a White Nation. And it's a lawyer woman by the name of Jacqueline Badalora. It's about a half an hour long, and it's very informative, and it sort of checks all y'all white folks to just let you know what it's all about.
All right, Gina is staying with us, as is Benno Schmidt. But for now, I want you to thank her for her honesty and her warmth. Next time we'll have some tissues up on here. Thank you, Gina Belafonte. All right. Please welcome WNYC producer for The Takeaway and my friend, Dana Roberson.
Good evening. I have a poem I'm going to read. Miscegenation by former poet laureate Natasha Trethewey. In 1965, my parents broke 2 laws of Mississippi. They went to Ohio to marry, returned to Mississippi. They crossed the river into Cincinnati, a city whose name begins with a sound like sin, the sound of wrong, miss in Mississippi. A year later, they moved to Canada, followed a route the same as slaves, the train slicing the white glaze of winter, leaving Mississippi. Faulkner's Joe Christmas was born in winter, like Jesus, given his name for the day he was left at the orphanage. His race unknown in Mississippi. My father was reading War and Peace when he gave me my name. I was born near Easter, 1966, in Mississippi. When I turned 33, my father said, "It's your Jesus year. You're the same age as he was when he died." It was spring, the hills green in Mississippi. I know more than Joe Christmas did. Natasha is a Russian name, though I'm not. It means Christmas child, even in Mississippi. Thank you.
Thank you, Dana. Now, please welcome to the stage our next guest, Ali Bien Ameh, to push us forward on the question of identity. So Ali, let's begin by asking, when were you born?
Did you say where or when?
Well, why don't you tell us where and when?
So somewhere in this city, I'm not quite sure specifically where, and in 1998.
Okay, so you are 18, 19?
19, yeah.
19 years old. So we've been talking about a lot of history. And I'm going to ask you a question slightly different from the questions I've been asking everyone else. And I'm going to confess to the audience, I've known Ali all his life. So when I say the word loving to you, what does it mean?
I think of the verb related to love much more so than I think about the actual case. And I didn't know the name of the case until very, very recently, sort of within the year, really. I just think about love, mostly my parents, and the relationship that they have. They're very loving, and they've extended that to my brother and I. So we grew up in a very loving household. If I think of it in any political context, it's more around gay marriage. And even that is sort of more recent than when I was very little, and that wasn't sort of part of my consciousness yet.
And then you did learn about the case recently in the context of a course you took?
Yes. I just finished my freshman year at Amherst College, and so I took a course on the history of sexuality, which was almost entirely just looking at laws in the United States. And it touched a little bit on the religious community and the medical community and their impact on who could love who and how they could love and sort of all of that. And so this case came up, of course.
Now, Ali, like Gina, has been with me on this project for the 3 years. So when I first asked him about his identity, he was 15 years old. And what we've learned in doing this project is that people who were born in 1964, like me, or 54 certainly, feel very constrained about race. I, for example, identify as black. It is not even a question. I identify as black. One drop, I'm black. But when I asked Ali about identity back in 2014, Ali was 15. And there was another young lady at the table who was 15, and they looked at the rest of us like, I don't know what y'all are talking about. I mean, race, yeah, we think about it, but you people are a little hung up. And I did ask him to think about it a little bit more, and so I'm going to ask him concretely. Ali, tell us a little bit about your ethnic and racial background, and then tell us about how people on Amherst College, or at Amherst, and of your generation, millennials, are you a millennial?
I think so. I think I'm sort of the cutoff.
Rub it in. So tell me, because that's what this project is about racial and ethnic background for you and how you were raised in terms of identity. But tell me how your generation thinks about identity.
Sure. I'd like to start by saying, as a 15-year-old, and now, I don't know very much. And particularly...
I don't know anything at 52.
Especially when it comes to identity specifically, and not the way that you asked it about sort of biology, but identity is a question that I always answer differently every single time because I don't really have the words for it, or I have too many words and not enough time. But I guess I would say I'm African American, Venezuelan, Puerto Rican, and Cuban, although I don't know necessarily all that much about those cultures. And I have two mothers, so I was the biological connection that I have is to the African American and Puerto Rican side, and then the sperm donor was Venezuelan and Cuban, and I don't really know him, and I don't care. So I've known much more about that half than anything else, and I've known somewhat about Haiti a little bit since my non-biological mother is Haitian. And has traveled a lot, and I've actually traveled a lot as well. I've been very lucky in that regard. So I've seen a whole bunch of other cultures all over the world, and I think that played a role in my sense of identity or lack thereof, perhaps. I was definitely somewhat sheltered, not in an academic sense. I certainly knew a lot about the history of race in America. It's critical that, especially every Black and brown person, because it's a life-threatening issue, but everyone needs to know about it. And I knew about it for sure. And living in New York, there's plenty of museums and history all around. So I was very lucky in that regard. But I was shielded from having to face the sort of physical hardship of it. I've only been stopped by the police once, and it was for a taillight, and it was a pleasant interaction. And I knew exactly where to put my hands. I knew where not to move them. I knew not to move too quickly. I knew to be polite, and I had. So
you've had that conversation.
Yeah, I had the conversations, but experiencing it was certainly different.
So as a political matter, you clearly understand how you are perceived in this country.
Yeah.
But it sounds as though you're perceived in many different ways depending on who's looking at you.
Absolutely. And that's also very different than how I perceive myself. And I can't really, explain my identity very well, but I know when I go out into the street here, I'm a brown person first and foremost. Others can't necessarily tell what kind of brown, but it doesn't matter as much. It matters that I'm a brown person, and so I'm aware of that and of how other people are going to react to that. Although internationally, and with other sort of non-white people, everyone thinks I'm one of them. I've been to India. They thought I was Indian. I've been to the Dominican Republic. They thought I was Dominican. It's kind of cool because I can definitely blend in everywhere. That's just me, I guess.
Where are your moms sitting?
One's there, and the other is there.
Taking pictures.
Yes.
Do we have a microphone to get to one of Ali's moms?
Yeah.
Veronica Jordan in the house. So, Veronica, I can't step you into the light. I'd like the audience to be able to see. You want to step on the stage? Oh, some light is coming up. So this is Veronica Jordan. She is Ali's mom. So, Veronica, what did you say to Ali, if anything, about identity when he was, say, 2, and then 5, and then 15? And you have another son. I see you hiding back there, Milan.
Son.
What did you say to your boys about identity as brown-skinned men in America growing up? I know you had to have some conversations about that, you and
we
Taina.
talked about it right away. We had to. You don't have the luxury of not telling your male children that they are brown and that they're going to face certain issues because they are brown. So because everybody on TV and books and everybody's white primarily, at least back then, there wasn't a lot of choice. I would show them their skin, and I would say, oh, your skin is so beautiful. And they didn't have straight hair. I would say, your curls are so beautiful, so that they could feel good about who they were and what they looked like, because we had them in private schools, and that's a different issue. And there weren't a lot of people who looked like them in those schools, so I wanted to make sure that they always felt good about themselves. And by the time they probably got to about 8 or 9, which maybe was early, I was very panicked about interactions with police. And so I told them very, very frankly, and probably too bluntly, when they see you, they're gonna think you're the N-word, and they're gonna think you're a criminal, and you have to be very, very careful about the way you interact with them, so you don't move your hands. You're very deferential. You say, officer, I'm gonna get my ID now. You just have to be very, very careful. And so we always kind of talked about that.
Even though they were multiracial boys.
But they're still brown. So whether you're a Latino thug or a black thug, it doesn't really matter. I mean, I grew up in Spanish Harlem, and my brothers were all harassed. Everybody I know was harassed by the cops. Every male I know was harassed by the cops. So I had a deep understanding that they could face that. And I tried to protect them. You try to protect them as much as you can, but at some point they leave the nest, and they have to know how to conduct themselves in a way that's safe.
Thank you, Veronica.
I just want to add for a second.
Please.
They chose the name Ali in part based off of Muhammad Ali, but it's a very Arab name, and I kind of look kind of Arab. So especially after 9/11, it wasn't just looking African American or looking Latino. It was also people telling me, "So are you going to fly the next plane into a building?" Which is it's very interesting experiencing Islamophobia when you are neither a Muslim nor an Arab or a Persian or anything like that. But that's sort of another aspect that I have had to be aware of.
And that may be, we have 7 more of these conversations coming up, and we are soliciting suggestions for what those other topics will be. Now, on December 11th, we're going to have Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. The 50th anniversary of that movie is December 11th, so that topic's taken. But this is a great topic. And there is obviously the subject of Islamophobia from the perspective of someone who is of that faith, but fascinating topic. So you can come back. Now, audience, we're coming to you. But before we open this up to the audience, I want to recognize, and Ali, I'm going to invite you to go back and sit with your fellow other Boxians, as we call them. Thank you, Ali Bien Amé. And I want to recognize, in addition to Gina Belafonte and Ali Bien Ameh. There are several contributors. We actually call them collaborators on the Other Box project who are here, and I'm going to ask you to stand. Teresa Beaumont. Yes, sister, my sister. Lala Brooks. I don't know if Ezra Edelman made it here tonight. He said Ezra. Hey. Kemi Plasquette was going to be here. I don't know if she made it. She was asking me what stop on the C train. Raul Roche could not make it here, but he did send a lovely surrogate. Adore Udoji. And Bliss Briard. Bliss should be right here in the front. Bliss, where are you? Because I need, there she is, because I need you to do something for me. You're going to come up. So as we turn to the audience, Bliss Briard is going to read a bit from her beautiful 2007 memoir. I even have my own copy. Bliss, I want you to see, not only do I have it, but look at how many little tabbies I have in this book. And my husband's going to tell you I didn't just put these tabbies in here. They have been here since 2007. Bliss, of course, is the daughter of the writer and New York Times book critic Anatole Briard, and her memoir is One Drop, My Father's Hidden Life. Oh, I don't even have to hold it up. They made a picture. A story of race and family secrets. Bliss, please.
Thank you. Thank you, Jami. I think I better tell you what the secret is, my mother said. She was sitting between my brother Todd and me on a bench outside of a hospital in Boston. The secret concerned my father, who was inside in the middle of an emergency surgery from which he would never recover. But we didn't know that then. My brother and I caught eyes behind her back. Well, she took a breath and let it out. Your father's part black. I burst out with a laugh. That's the secret? Daddy's part black? That's all? Todd asked. That's it, my mother said, allowing herself a smile. We asked a few questions. How black was he? After all, he didn't look black. Neither did his sister Lorraine or his mother, whom we'd seen once or twice when we were little. My mother explained that my father had mixed blood, and his parents were both light-skinned Creoles from New Orleans, where race mixing had been common. And the one-drop rule, which held that any black ancestry made you black, was in force. She said that his parents had to pass for white in order to get work in 1930s New York where they'd moved, which confused my father about what their family was or was supposed to be. He was the lightest child out of his 3 siblings, and the fact that his 2 sisters lived as black was one of the reasons that we never saw them. My mother said that when my father was growing up in Brooklyn, he'd been ostracized by both white and black kids alike. The black kids picked on him because he looked white, and the white kids rejected him because they knew his family was black. He'd come home with his jacket torn, and his parents wouldn't ask what happened. My mother said that he didn't tell us about his racial background because he wanted to spare his own children from going through what he did. So they raised me as a WASP in Connecticut instead. So this means that we're part black too, I said, taking in the news. The idea thrilled me, as though I'd been reading a fascinating history book and then discovered my own name in the index. I felt like I mattered in a way I hadn't before. I also realized that I needed to go back and relearn my history, starting with my father's family. As I did so, I began to feel a shift in my worldview away from the white one I had grown up with. African Americans, according to W.E.B. Du Bois, lived behind a racial veil that gave them a second sight to observe the world more clearly while remaining themselves unseen. Ironically, the invisibility of my own African ancestry had given me a uniquely suited vantage point from which to view the current status of Du Bois's veil. I had a chance to hear how white people talked when they thought they were alone, sometimes making overtly racist comments, but more often unwittingly sharing observations that indicated a subtle belief in African Americans' inferiority or insurmountable difference. I'd been privy to the kind of conversations that black people had among themselves, passing remarks that told of the degree of separateness that they felt from whites. And while it seemed for African Americans that the day-to-day reminders of otherness on the job and the store with friends were certainly less frequent and pronounced than in Du Bois's time, I noted a recurring gulf between white and black perspectives on matters of race that often made me feel hopeless about ever finding a common ground. I want to say that Jami asked me to read this passage, which I was very pleased to do, and it was interesting to see how much my viewpoint had changed in the more than 10 years since I wrote it, and 25 years since I discovered I was biracial. I don't, for example, accept this division in viewpoint between black and white as readily as I once used to. And in fact, I think my own story shows that you don't need to be raised as black or look black or Puerto Rican to gain a black perspective. I think you simply need to study our history, as already been pointed out, and then have a strong sense of right and wrong. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bliss. Questions? It's that time. Statements of identity, if anyone is feeling moved. And also, questions for any of the panelists, or I think, Bliss, you'd probably be willing, right? I saw a couple of hands shoot right up. And please say who you are if you're willing. We'd like to make it sort of a conversation, as it's supposed to be. Hello.
Hi,
your roles.
I'm Sarah Stavro.
Yes, Sarah. Thank you.
I have a question. I think it's perfect after Bliss. Why do you think intelligent black people in particular believe in the one-drop rule when it was created by white people to keep black people slaves in 2017? It blows my mind.
That is your experience, Sarah?
Yes, because people say, you're black. If you have 1 ounce of black blood, you're black. I think it's retarded. I think if I was a slave master, I would create that rule too to keep you a slave. But now we are free individuals. Why do you think? Because you have 1 drop of, I guess the question is, who doesn't have 1 drop of black blood?
Here's what I want to do. I want to have the microphone come over to Gina for that. And also, Bliss, you explained very briefly the 1-drop rule there. Do you mind taking a moment to say just a little more about it?
Sure.
Because your book is just so brilliant on it, and the book is 1 drop again. If you care about knowing that history, it's a fantastic history and also just a beautiful read. So you can get both in 1 book. So can you say just a little more about the 1-drop rule? Because many people, I'm surprised to find, don't know it.
Sure.
And then, Gina, I know you want to respond to that point.
Well, it was embedded in the anti-miscegenation laws, but you can't separate people if you don't define them first. And my family was from Louisiana, and particularly in Louisiana, you had it took a really long time to come up with a definition of what percent you need to be black or to be white, because there was a lot of people knew they had a lot of race mixing back in their own family tree. So finally, and it was actually it was an irony that I discovered in doing research, is my own father's family, his second cousin, who's the legal case that set the precedent in Louisiana, that if you had 1 traceable ancestor, if somebody doing genealogy could find a black ancestor, and there was actually a race clerk that worked at the health department that had piles and piles of archives, and they'd look through, then you were considered legally black. And so that was the rule in Louisiana. In many other states, in some states it was as much, it could be a quarter and then you could be white. But they also changed it depending upon if they needed to grow the labor force, then they needed more white workers. They'd say, okay, let's change the percentage, and so these people can work. So it was an economic decision. If I can, I'd like to speak to what I found is the reason why it's taken a long time. And my father's sister said, one of the reasons that apartheid took so long in South Africa is that people separated black people from the coloreds. And so I think that for me, it was important to have everybody under this tent of black identity, whether you're 1 drop or 100%, until we achieve a real civil rights movement, because you needed a united force.
Well said. Gina.
We're not free. We're just not. We're just not free. We're really not. I mean, if you read any Frantz Fanon and you read about colonialism and the colonialism of the psyche and the mind, we're just not free. We've taken on roles and we've taken on talk about the other box. We put ourselves in boxes, and we identify based on what generationally we've learned from other people choosing to tell us how we need to identify. If someone asked me a question, I was like, I want to go back to the beginning of time, before there was a need for one to be better than the other, for everyone to understand that there is enough resource for us all. But because there was a design around how we need to make people think and understand who they are, which is all connected and based to economics and wealth and how much you have. That's how we generate generations of trauma, generations of wealth. As you see, it's constantly handed down by the same lineage. It's just, we're just not free. And that's why people still think that way.
I can't sit up here all by myself, so I'm running this mic like Oprah. Professor Lewis. Go.
Hi, I'm still getting used to that. Title.
You deserve it. Go on. This is an expert in anti-miscegenation laws in the United States, and he comes every time we talk about this. I see this man, so now we've become good friends. So please are you going to make a statement? You're going to ask a question? You're going to do both?
I was going to answer the question that was asked.
Do it. Can everybody see? Do you want to come up?
Oh God, really?
Come on now. You got to move. We're on a tight schedule.
It's like Donahue.
Bum, 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 bum. All right. Now, I want you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everybody. I'm Elliot Lewis.
We met at Fansion's One Drop of Love, and she's part of the other body. Fansion, Cox, DiGiovanni. We don't both need a mic. We could be siblings. Do you think? So we met at Fansion, Cox, DiGiovanni's One Drop of Love. No, she was here for How I Got Over. With is Rebecca here? Okay, so Rebecca Carroll's my colleague at WNYC. She produces on race issues, and she has something called How I Got Over. And she had Fansion, Cox, DiGiovanni on this stage. And you came for that?
Yeah, Fansion and I go way back. We've known each other for like 10 years.
Okay, off topic.
Yeah.
Okay, so we met there because Fansion has a project called One Drop of Love, right? And it's all about the history of race mixing, of racism, of anti-miscegenation, and that's when we met.
Yes, correct.
And then we met again at another, and again. So please, answer the question.
Yeah, so I'm Elliot Lewis. I'm a professor of journalism at SUNY Purchase College in Westchester County. Awesome. We'll talk later. And I'm also the author of a book called Fade, My Journeys in Multiracial America, which came out in 2006, which talks about the history of the one-drop rule. The chapter that talks about the history of one-drop rule is actually called the one-drop suggestion in the book. But to answer the question, why do black people still embrace this idea of one-drop? So my family background, I identify as biracial. I am actually a second or third generation biracial person, depending on how you count, but I'm first generation in claiming it. Both of my mixed race parents identified as black. I identify as biracial. Why? Well, because there's 30 years difference, 30 plus years difference in terms of how we grew up. Why do black people still embrace this? Well, yes, originally it was designed for slave owners to have more slaves, but at some point, right, during the civil rights movement, it became a way of having more black people, right? And there is some logic to this, right? If discrimination follows one drop, then building a movement to rise up and challenge that discrimination also follows one drop, right? Because if, there were no biracial water fountains, right? A biracial person can't say, oh, I'm half and half, so I guess I can drink from both. No, right? If you're a biracial person, you drink from the colored water fountain. So if discrimination follows one drop, then it makes sense that any movement rising up to challenge that discrimination would organize around one drop as well. And so that's how we ended up here.
Professor Lewis. Good stuff. Okay, who's next? Who's next? Don't worry, you don't have to come up here. Ellen wants the mic. Oh, I'm coming. Oh my gosh, I have a whole gaggle of folks. You have a mic. Go, start talking.
I have a mic. I just happen to have a mic.
Tell us who you are.
Okay, my name's Jennifer Morgan. I'm a history professor at NYU.
All right.
My parents, John and Claudia Morgan, were married in 1964. My mother is African American. My father was white. And when you
married the year that the Civil Rights Act passed.
Correct. In New York City, in Brooklyn.
Did you call the show the other day?
No, I did
Oh,
not.
another woman called with a very similar story. Go ahead.
Well, there are many of us, apparently. And I was really fascinated by what you said earlier, that for those of us who were, so I was born in 1966, and for me, my parents were very clear, my father, my white father, and my African-American mother, that I was black. My brother and I were black, and if we pretended that we weren't, that was where we were going to get in trouble. And for us, it was easy, in part because my father's family had rejected him and the marriage. And so my family was all African American.
Your father was the white person?
My father is the white person. And so they came around eventually, but it took a while. And so in terms of my extended family, it was all African American people. And so that question that Gina Belafonte answered so well, which is like, what's the difference, how do you navigate the distance between how you perceive yourself and how others perceive you, is a really powerful one. But I wanted to just offer another kind of, my desire to understand the answer to the question of what are you, meant that I went to graduate school and studied history, and that I have written my whole career on 16th and 17th century origins of race and racial slavery, because it's not just about 19th century slavery in this country. It's about it's really about the history of capitalism and the history of notions of what is modern, that situate us as racially defined people. So for me, the answer to what are you always has to be I am black, even though for people around me, they may or may not see that. They may or may not identify me that way. My daughter, who is 19 and who is right there. No, put your hand down, girl. Put your hand down. I think has a slightly more complicated answer to that question as well. Like Ali, I think there's a really interesting, when I grew up in New York City, there were very few of us who were in interracial families, who I knew, very, very few. And now it seems much more common, and I think that's good. There's another way to answer the question.
And I do want to be clear, although we talked about and you know this, because this is what you do, you know it way better than I know, but I did mention the Racial Purity Act of 1924, but those anti-miscegenation laws go back to the 1600s.
Exactly.
1600s. That's when they started, and they were rewritten and recodified after the Revolutionary War, but they go way back to colonial days. Does your daughter want to speak to this issue? Pass the mic on down.
Do you?
I would love to, Mama. Well, okay, so my name's Emma, and I would, for starters, would like to say that I identify as black, even though I am technically biracial in some manner. And I go to Swarthmore College. I'm also a rising sophomore, so I really wanted to talk a little bit more to Ali, to see if our to see if our experiences are similar or different, because completing my first year at Swarthmore, which is a small liberal arts college, which is known to be a very radical and progressive college, I was actually quite startled by the different understanding of blackness in terms of how you can be both black, how you can interact with people who are not black, what it means to claim blackness as your identity, even if you have white friends, and how that changes depending on how white your community is or isn't. So I think that's something which was, so I'm involved in an interracial relationship. My boyfriend's white and from Virginia. Yep. And it was really, I just came back from Cuba also 2 days ago. And I was doing a project on Black maternity in Cuba. And it was so fascinating to see like how race is just completely differently understood in Cuba, not as you ask people, how do you identify? And I would respond, my name's Emma, and I'm a Black American. But they would identify as, my name is, Carla, and I identify as Cuban. And I would have to ask that second question of, how do you identify racially? And then they would define it as, oh, I'm Cuban, and I guess you could call me Black or mestizo or mulata. And it was really interesting. I would like to just say that it was really interesting to be with my classmates who were mostly Black on that trip. And they were pushing back at how race could be the second word in your identity, how it could be this, that your nation, that your country, your place comes first, and then your Blackness comes. And I think that is something I'm trying to navigate a little bit more. And I'm wondering, Ali, if you've had these similar conversations about like what it means to be Black enough in a small college where we're frankly surrounded by a lot of white wealthy people who've belonged to these institutions for a long time. And I'm definitely comfortable being raised by a professor, or two professors actually, to interact with these white communities. And I'm sort of viewed as an outsider in terms of the Black community because I'm comfortable with white people and I can talk to white people and enjoy my relationships with white people. And so I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit more on that.
So we're in very similar places. Stan, okay. I also I think I've literally been referred to several times as the bridge, the racial bridge to white people, because I could communicate with them since I went to a private school with a lot of white people in it. But I guess Amherst might be a little bit different, although I think overall very similar. I wasn't ostracized by the Black people or any of the sort of minority communities that I am a part of. It might have been because of my skin tone, because I think some of the much lighter Black people did feel a little bit ostracized. But I certainly identify as whatever brown, Black, whatever people sort of say. I'm fine with it, and I think that I did manage to have that acceptance, and yet, with the acceptance, there was still certainly that, why don't you talk to them, and why don't you explain to these, extremely ignorant masses of white people who are mostly, although not entirely, well-intentioned, how this works and how, despite their best efforts, they'll never quite get there. Because there was at Amherst, there was a lot of white people who wanted to understand it, but also thought that they already did. And so we had to sort of, we had to basically teach them, no, you don't really get it yet. You can try, you'll never totally get there. But there was a lot of that, I think, much more than there was sort of picking apart who was Black or Black enough or how Black. So I think the Black community was much more unified in looking at and I guess talking to the white community than there was sort of picking apart from the inside.
Okay, I'm gonna give Gina Belafonte the last
just
word.
very quickly to that. I would also say that because of the tone of your Blackness, there are some people who are darker who feel that lighter skinned Black people can't speak to being Black because we don't experience the same kind of issues that Blacker people face. And I have to say they're right. And there is a certain sense of privilege pending your tone, pending your circles. But I also will say that Black people who are Blacker than we are also have no clue what it's like to really be sort of wanderers of not being able to claim a space and having to be like the one who can talk to the white people. It's like, excuse my language. Well, no, okay, I won't go there. But it's like, I don't want to, when you want me to talk to people about being human, I can go there. But there is like, it's a new race, it's this new space. And having one drop of blackness in you does not give you the right to speak to hardcore black issues. What I will say, though, which I think is so beautiful and so amazing, is that if you have one drop of black in you, please claim it and be an ally for those who do have challenges around skin tone. Because it's just, there's that dynamic that is often not really looked at in terms of being of mixed race and being medium toned, and the spaces that we have trouble not only identifying ourselves at, but people just don't know how to approach us or think that we are this bridge, and that's a lot of weight to carry.
Now, I see all those hands, but I also see that clock. And every day on All Things Considered, I look at the clock, and it looks at me. And it shuts me down. It's doing that right now. Now, there's something outside called the talk box. It looks like an old-fashioned telephone. If you have something that you are just burning to say, you walk up to the talk box, you pick it up, and my voice will speak sweetly at you and say, "Tell me your story." And then you speak into it. I saw you talking to it, Emma. I saw you. And Emma, was it a good experience? Yeah. So you go up, and if there's something you have to say, please say it to the talk box, because we're curating your conversations, your perspectives, your stories. And this is only the first of, as I said, many conversations. So I'm sorry that we're moving on. All right. Did everybody fill out their forms? Are some of you still struggling to figure out which box to check? What you are filling out is the 1960 census page on race. 1960 was the first U.S. census that was taken that allowed people to select race for themselves. Before that, the census taker would come and look at you and determine your race for you. 1960 was the first year in which they allowed U.S. citizens, usually the head of household, would make the determination about race for each member of the family. But as we instructed you, you could only choose one box. Now, the other box was a part of the census starting in 1900. It was there a long, long time ago. But other would apply for a whole lot of people, right, if you only had those 9 categories. Look how many categories are missing, right? Now, we're going to put up the 2010 census. Do we have that slide? It's 2 slides because it's become very busy. We're not going to walk through it because we don't have the time, but there's a lot more to it now. And this is the short form. If you get the long form, you got pages. In the year 2000, they allowed you to start checking more than one box. The year 2000, more than one box, which is now the fastest growing demographic. People who check more than one box, multiracial people. So the purpose of the exercise was to have us all think about what it means to be constrained in the way the Lovings were in the year 1960. And by the way, it was the same grouping in the year 1970. Didn't change. To be forced to choose between the heritage of, say, your mother and your father, or to feel constrained by the category of other. We just wanted you to think about that. Before we go, I want to say a few thank yous, and the biggest thank you I want to make is to my mother, who is here tonight. She's a shy person, so I know she doesn't like that I'm recognizing her. Here's a picture of my parents in Harlem in 1962. Now, the best part of this picture, they are dashing, but Yes, they are. But my favorite thing is that sign, cocktails backwards. My parents were married in 1956, 11 years before the Loving decision came down. At that time, 26 states made their marriage illegal. And my father passed away 2 years ago. They were just 6 months shy of their 60th wedding anniversary, which I think says a lot about the promise of America. I want to thank them for the courage they had to take the journey from there to here. Thank you, Mom. I also want to thank Laura Walker, our president and CEO at WNYC, Dean Capello, our executive vice president and chief content officer at WNYC, and Jim Schachter, who is my boss. He's the vice president of news, all of whom have supported this project from the minute I walked into their offices with the idea for it. And I have to say a big thank you to the Green Space team, Ellen Rolfes especially, because boy, I have been busting her butt for weeks. And she has worked very hard. She basically made this event happen tonight. And our amazing partners at the New York Historical Society, who will be working with us on the exhibition of Carrie Mae Weems' photographs of our collaborators. You can check out The Other Box Project at theotherboxproject.org for updates about our events and our newsletter, which is going to launch in September. Our hashtag on Twitter is The Other Box Project. And our partners at the New York Historical Society, if you can't get enough about Loving versus Virginia, Benno Schmidt, are going to have a conversation about the legacy of white supremacy after Loving. That's on Tuesday, October 24th at 6:30 p.m. at the New York Historical Society. They have a beautiful auditorium. Brent Staples of the New York Times will be moderating, and Dorothy Roberts of the University of Pennsylvania will be in conversation with him. Now, a little gift. If you have a heart, does anybody have a heart? You have a heart on your census form? Well, you're going to win a copy. Oh, if you have a heart. Oh. Well, you know what? I feel like I have to give you I'll give you a hug. Anybody who has a heart, I will give you a hug at the end of this program. But if you have a heart on your census form, you win a copy of Sean and Selena's book. So 3 lucky winners tonight. Check in at the box office, show them your census form with a heart on it, because we're going to change America, ladies and gentlemen. Now, tonight we have a special guest to take us out. Ken Tanabe of lovingday.org, who has been working for years to make this day a national holiday, and it's happening little by little across the country. Loving Day is becoming a holiday, is going to take us out with a very special treat. Ken, come on up.
Check, check. Check 1, 2. Ah, there it is.
A normal day in 1958, Richard and Mildred made their vows and said I do. But late one night they were arrested in their bedroom, locked in a jail cell. The wedding was a crime, but now we'll say happy, happy loving day. Every year we celebrate for the ones we love and the ones that pave the way to be in love with whom we please, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what they say. We know we're meant to be. 1967, on the 12th of June, the Loving case was won and changed a lot of lives. loving was their name. They were humble, they were strong. The world's not perfect, so let's finish what they started on. Now we'll say happy, happy loving day. Every year we celebrate for the ones we love and the ones that pave the way to be in love with whom we please, no matter what ethnicity, no matter what they say. No, we're meant to be. If your life looks like a loving case, then you know you're in the right place. And if you live your life in a loving way, you know you're not alone on loving day. If your life looks like a loving case, then you know you're in the right place. If you live your life in a loving way, you know you're not alone on loving day. So keep on loving. Loving Day is your celebration. Na 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 now. Keep on loving. Loving Day is your celebration. Na 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 now. Keep on loving. Loving Day is your celebration. Na 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 now. Keep on loving. Loving Day is your celebration. Na 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 na. Everyone in every nation, share it with the next generation. Loving Day is your celebration now.
Happy Loving Day. Thank you.
Ken Tanabe, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for coming. Happy Loving Day.